Hey everybody, this is Chuck here for DeucesCrack.com, coming at you another episode of Beginning Omaha 8. In this video, we're going to talk a little bit about blind defense, what kind of hands should we be defending, why we're defending those hands. Then move on to when and why to be 3-betting pre-flop, specific to Omaha 8 or better. And again, everything we're doing here in these pre-flop episodes is tying into our post-flop game plan. So it's an important thing to keep in mind as you play more O8 and as you watch future videos, that everything we're doing now is to prepare ourselves for decisions that we have to make post-flop. So let's talk a little bit about blind defense. It's pretty unique in Omaha 8 or better versus a lot of games, simply because I think O8, and I do fancy myself someone that plays all the games, is the one where you're most likely to be taking a limped flop. Players do think it's correct to limp a lot more. It's just a more passive game. So, in other words, we're not expecting other players at the table to have those seat-to-seat pre-flop raising ranges like we had. So we can't really be planning to defend certain things versus an under-the-gun open versus certain things versus a middle position open. Now, for the first orbit or two, it's pretty easy for us to just go by some defaults here. But in general, we're going to be looking at our defense as a function of how loose the range we think we're facing is. And, obviously we're going to start with a tight early position raise, but then go over to aggressive buttons and see what type of hands we need to defend versus what type of player. In general, let's talk a little bit about our play from the blinds. In any game, being in the blinds is a significant disadvantage. Right? Maybe not. I'm sure you can create a game, but let's skip the details for once. Me, of course. So we need to have a specific strategy. We have to keep a lot of things in mind and be prepared to be forced to play these hands out of position. Right? Our goal is to lose as little as possible when we're playing in the blinds. And it doesn't mean we're getting a good price. We have to call everything. And really what we're going to end up finding is that people's poor play from the blinds is what makes playing O8 really so profitable. The most important thing that we start with when we play from the blinds is that we have a post-flop game plan. In any situation when you're going to be re-raising a hand from the blinds, which we're not going to be doing very often, but more importantly, if we're going to be calling a hand out of the blinds or defending, you want to have an idea of how you're going to be able to play that hand post-flop. What are you actually going to do? For example, let's say you want to defend a hand like Jack, 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 Jack. I would say, what are you going to do with that? Just try to bluff a straight or call with your naked pair of jacks. Try to think of what the best possible flop for your hand is going to look like and if that really is very good for you. Right? Some hands, even when you flop the nuts, you're not that excited. Jack 10, 6, 6. I mean, it's great to have flopped 7, 8, 9, but it's really not that good of a situation for us. If the board pairs, if the low comes in, that's an easy mental test you can do. Just what would your post-flop game plan look like with this hand? Now, I'm not saying you have to sit there and mull it over and over again, but it's something you can keep in mind. And honestly, if you're in a slow game, it's something to think about while you're waiting for people to limp to you in the big blind. One of the most important things you have to do when out of position is really avoid middling cards. Now, of course, when I'm saying middling cards, I mean naked middling cards. So I'm not saying let's fold ace 2, 7, 8, right? I'm saying hands that are relying on the middling cards as opposed to that's the garbage that's helping us here. But they really don't do much for us out of position. We do not like check raising the low end of straights and the low end of those middling boards. In general, it's just not a play you're going to make all too often in O8. And like I said, these are hands that can also flop nuts or something very strong. And it's really just when you hit the best flop, it's still a check callable flop. And that's what happens with these hands. And the reason why people would want to consider playing them is because they can, again, make a low, because it can make a low. A 78 low is technically a low. Again, in the same way that 2-7 high is technically a high hand that can't exist. But in other words, they don't really have much value for us here. And out of position where we're going to have to be playing a guessing game, it's really important that we have some strength to our hand. A big problem that you're going to run into is that you're going to play against players, and it's not a problem because we make a ton of money off of this, but players that just don't know how to play Omaha 8 or better. Players that make solid, I'll in 4 lines of text show you why it is a fundamental error. And when that's the case, we need to have some strength in our checking and calling range when out of position, because very often it's going to be correct to call because we're getting a good price. And players play sporadically and bluff in spots that make no sense. All right, even though we can read a board texture and know what's a good card to barrel, doesn't mean our opponents do. So for this reason, I really say avoid those 7s and 8s and 9s. They're really, really bad cards. And finally, the most important part of early adjusting in 08 is going to be from blind defense and noticing your opponent's opening ranges and limping ranges. I talked about it earlier. Again, when you do something with one hand, you can't do it with another. People, a big part of that last point I made on people not understanding the game means you can then interpret that information to be, this is how this player thinks you're supposed to play. They think that, for example, I was playing the other day and I opened under the gun in a 5-handed game, and the small blind 3-bet me with Jack, 7-5 rainbow, which is a very, very bad hand. And it's a really bad hand to be 3-betting out of position, even worse from my under the gun open. And that was a moment where, I don't even know if I won the hand. All I remember is thinking, this is a great situation for me because now I know this player thinks that these pocket pairs and any 2 low qualifying cards qualifies for a 3-bet out of position. This range is going to be so wide, I can now adjust my play accordingly. And you better believe that I'm going to adjust any blind defense I have against this player because their ranges are going to be incredibly wide. And that's what I mean by be ready to adjust. Like, the real way to make profit in this game is to find the mistakes players are making and punish them for it at every turn. And the easiest way to do that is to pay close attention and be ready to adjust. And this is going to be one of the first areas where I think most of our thoughts, most of our the way we approach is going to be based on how we're reading the play of the other opponents at the table. Now, let's start just in general with our big blind defense range. Again, we're going to start from an under the gun open, see what's important about playing a hand out of position, and then see how we adjust that when we're playing against a more aggressive opponent who's opening in later position, and we can scale accordingly. So first, against a tight opening raise. Now, this is under the gun range. I titled this particularly versus tight open because the villain that plays the same range from seat to seat absolutely exists in Omaha 8 or better. In other words, they think that ace-2 offsuit is always a limp and ace-2 suited is always a raise. So we know that's in their preflop raising range. Now, it's not going to be as severe as that. It's not going to be as, over the top aggressive. Over the top strong, not aggressive. But it's still something to keep in mind. Like, players aren't going to suddenly open raise a hand in Omaha 8 or better if they truly believe that a hand has a 0 or 1 playability factor, which is pretty common. So we're looking against those types of players. And first off, we're basically all of our second tier premiums, most of our ace wheel hands with any kind of help that are okay to playable are going to be defendable here. It's still a limit Omaha 8 or better game. We are getting a good price to call. Again, a big part of the way we're playing pre-flop is dependent on our opponent's post-flop play, because that's what we're expecting. That's what formulating a game plan is about. Now, these hands in general are going to be strong enough to defend for pretty much any range, unless it's like the nittiest of nitty. One nice thing to keep in mind in general is tight usually correlates to passive when it comes to good games. Against good tags, against even like our open raising ranges, I really wouldn't, I'm not going to be folding any of these hands. So we're fine against good tags, but on the passive side, these hands even increase in value. And that's one of the things I'll be looking at is how passive is my opponent? Because obviously the less they're continuation betting, the more they're going to let us get away with things. The happier I am to open my range a little bit, but we'll talk about that more. Now, if we don't have those premiums, in other words, we don't really have that ace to go along with our hand, when am I going to be deciding whether or not I want to defend? And I think the best way to picture it mentally is to picture building off a 23 low. In other words, naked 2-3 isn't quite enough to be defending versus range, but you need a little bit more to go along with it. How much more help can these cards do for you, right? I'm not too excited about defending 2-3, 2-3, but 2-3-4 Jack with a Jack high suit. Not a bad hand to call, especially against a tight player. Tight usually means a little bit more post-flop straightforwardness. We can have a little bit of post-flop maneuverability there, and we're getting a good price on our call. We can flop some good board textures. That's probably one of the worst hands I would consider defending too. So something along there. If you put another wheel card in there, even a 6 is helping out, right? When 2-3-7 queen rainbow, it just doesn't really do much for you. Like, as much as that hand has a 23 going in there really are no board textures you can check raise, say for ace 4-5. And we need to be winning some pots. We need to be scooping some pots out of position. We can't just be calling and hoping to get half and letting our opponent check down. We want to be able to put those ace XX hands in tough spots that now have to decide whether or not they want to call down on a ace Broadway, or ace low Broadway board, when maybe we pick up a flush draw or something like that. We want to have some post-flop strength to our hand. We want scoopness, right? And that's what I'm saying. You can start with the 23 low, and then the more you add to it, the better. 3-4-5 king with the king high suit. Obviously, there's more flops that we can hit better than that. So I've taken away the 2. But we got a 4 and a 5, which work well. They're 2 wheel cards, and now I got a king high suit. So now I've got some boards where I can flop nut flush draw, plus good low draw, something like that. And most importantly, it's really important that we avoid worse hands in this situation. Over defending versus a loose aggressive open. Versus a tight open. You're gonna have to make so many thin flop decisions that even the more passive players are going to be able to play well against you by accident. So really avoiding those middling cards if there's any kind of tight open, because they are almost completely worthless. And what's even worse is on those board textures against the passive players, we can count on them actually checking back sometimes too when we flop and things like that. So as much as it may present enough opportunity that we might want to call a little wider just because, that might be a little more passive. In general, just avoiding worse hands is pretty key, specifically with middling cards. Now, I talked a little bit about why we open up our range a little bit. When can we be calling wider, right? Because right now we're on a pretty short leash here when we're defending hands out of position. We are really only focused on wheel-esh cards or hands that do okay on ace-high board textures / can peel some middle ones, make some decent top pairs, right? Like that king 2-4-5. Yeah, we got some pretty good board textures too. We can, we flop some decent flush draws. We can have some top pairs plus low draws, things like that. When do we open up our range? When is it acceptable to actually play hands? Because I was kind of prodding at the idea of a hand having like a Boolean can play or not play value to it. First and foremost, the wider the opening range, the wider the calling range. Now, equities run incredibly close in 4-card games in general. So this isn't, unfortunately, this isn't like, if someone's opening 100% of hands, and just like it is in any other game, you can open 100% of hands, but you certainly can't defend them. But when someone is, and I know for a fact, opening all of their 8x and 7x, type hands, so they're and even worse when they're c-betting, like, 78 naked low on a 23 board, just a nut worst low draw possible. In other words, just with no regard for not even looking, just clicking. Those hands are just going to have more value because you can call them more, because your hand is likely to be best a little bit more often. So against a tight player, think about the types of hands that you're going to be blindly check calling 3 times because you have a little bit of a piece. And that happens in any game, right? You flop top pair in a limit game, or good second pair, good kicker against an aggressive player. You're going to end up calling down at the very least, if not check raising. And And what happens against aggressive players that are opening wider is that range of hands are willing to call threes due to it simply widens a little bit more. But also, it could be a function of the seat the player is raising in. Second, we can call wider when there are more players in the pot. This is true, and this is something I think a lot of players struggle with in 08 is like the raise, call, and I'm in the big blind with 4 complete junk cards. How do I know if I can call here? Well, I mean, the good news is the math says it's probably pretty unlikely you're making that big of a mistake, unless you're sitting on the worst possible worst hand. You're just getting such a good price that it's pretty likely that your hand is going to flop well enough, often enough that you can call. Now, I think could you call, should you call, would you call are all very different questions. But what you should be thinking about in this situation is not so much should I be calling, but you should only be thinking what flops can I lead multi-way here? What flops can I call multi-way here? What boards can I scoop on? What board textures is this hand going to do well on, right? Let's say we have 9, 6, 7 rainbow, and we're trying to see if we want to defend in a multi-way pot. Well, I know a couple of things about 9, 6, 7 off the top of my head. Number one, whenever we flop top set, there is, I mean, we could flop a full house. Obviously, we can make quads, all those hands. That's fine. With any 4 cards, you're gonna be able to talk about those combos, right? But when we hit the flop, when we really hammer the flop, we make a straight, we flop a wrap, it's never a board texture we can lead. It's never a board texture we can check, raise, or jam multi-way. It's never a board texture that we're happy to have a ton of players in the pot with. We have no protection on suitedness. It just does not play well multi-way because, yes, we could technically win a hand, but with all the, especially in a multi-way game when you're making these decisions with like a raise and 4 calls, with all of that just strangeness out there, with all the possibility that the players post-flop are just going to be jamming the naked low because they know it's a good hand and now you don't know what to do with your second nut straight, there's really not much incentive for us to call there because it's going to be so easy for that to be relatively close to reverse implied odds. We can make a lot of post-flop mistakes there, and calling as is barely a function of the price we're getting. And if you really want to break it down, rake is another consideration. So we can go even that far. But that's something that makes this a new game, right? An unevolved game, as I like to say. People haven't gone that far to the point where they know it's even close to 110% correct calling. And it's not in PLO either. Raise and 4 calls, what's the best possible range? And that's exciting. And that's why we're covering more how to think in the situation as opposed to just basic guidelines. And when you get better at that process, because really what we're doing is we are forming a better post-flop plan. We're having a better idea for the way our opponents are going to play, what kind of board textures we can jam and win a big pot with. That's the kind of thing I keep notes on. Player likes to jam naked nut low, even on flush board, which that situation is obviously way worse. You can see, and if you can't, I mean, feel free to comment, but why jamming ace of hearts, 3 of hearts with no spades on a 2-5-8 all spades is really bad. If someone is re-raising you, you block none of the spades, and there you go, both the cards are there. And one thing to better post-flop position, that mainly keep in mind in small blind versus big blind, and we'll talk about an aggressive small blind opening range, what we're going to be defending, but also when the small blind calls, what that does for our post-flop position. We're going to be able to, like, if the cutoff opens, small blind calls, our relative position post-flop is a little bit better because we're going to get to call closing the action with potential overcall already. The cutoff has a little bit less incentive to continuation bet. So we're getting a better price with maybe a better chance of free cards depending on the post-flop play. So all these things you want to be keeping in mind when you're trying to decide whether or not you want to play a hand. Now, we talked about the tight range opening. What about versus a more aggressive button opener? The type of player that maybe I think is raising a little bit too much from the button. So obviously, we have our whole super tight range thing. We don't have to no one's folding ace two against this guy, right? We all agree. But wheel cards are very important here. I was happy to have my calling all wheels line here, but the important thing to remember is wheel cards can lead to post flop strength. Wheel cards lead to gut shots. Wheel cards lead to scoop hands. And wheel cards, more importantly, dominate the bad, junky 47, 48, 75 type openings on the low end that I expect a lot of these players to have. So we're playing a little bit tighter than our opening, and we're profiting because I think these players in general play these hands way too wide. And I understand that they have position, but not playing them well in position is also a problem. Not saying there can't be situations where you want to be opening some 75s from the button. 84 is almost always, well, and again, when I say that, I don't mean ace 8-4. I mean the bottom two cards. There may be a few combos and some suitedness to them that I want to play, but these players, with almost no concern, just raising a bunch of junk. So having wheel cards, having hands that, what's nice about wheel cards is when you pick up some lows, you often can pick up a gut shot or something with it, some connectedness to it. It's just much better than bothering with like a 2-7 or something like that. Those hands are just garbage. I'd always, we want to avoid those 7s and 8s and 9s and 6s. Those would be, I would put in the less than wheel in category. Need some help. I'm not folding all of my 6X, and I'm not folding all of my, I guess some of my ultimate premium 75s. Like I'm not just going to automatically fold King 7-5 double suited. I'm not going to automatically fold. Maybe even like King 5-7 double suited. I probably wouldn't automatically fold things like that. But you see that it's got to be double suited. Now, King 6-2 single suited, I think is probably worth a defend. Like some of the 6Xs, if they're pretty good, are worth defending. A Jack 6-2 rainbow is just not going to cut it. The top two cards really do matter quite a bit because we want to have some strong top pair potential against aggressive opponents. When we're talking about post flop game plan, we're looking for hands that can take a beating. I'm looking for a hand that my opponent's going to bet 2-3 times, and I'm pretty comfortable calling. And I also know there's going to be some board textures I can check raise, and I'm going to be check raising wider, of course. Maybe instead of check raising my second nut low and second nut flush draw, I just need a low and a flush draw. But the villain has a wide range, and you have two choices: open up your range and fight back, which is the right choice, or the wrong choice, which is tighten up and let them run us over, which is what I love when players do. So in general, we're just trying to think about hands that can play post-flop in that way, if that makes sense. And finally, so against tight openers from late position, and more importantly, against really passive players, I get a little speculative post-flop because you're getting 3.5 to 1. Pre-flop. You're getting 3.5 to 1. If you have hands that can flop nuts, like King 10X, hands like that, and players that are going to check back when they pair their bottom card, or simply just not continuation bet too much, I like those hands. Also against players that don't fire the second barrel, because I can flop top pair and check call once and know where I stand immediately and make a 100% correct fold on the turn, pretty often. And against those players, I don't think it's that bad to be defending pretty wide. Now, when you know a player is going to be betting the turn incredibly wide and just bombing away, the type of player that flops bottom pair plus one live low card and then turns bottom two and bets again anyway, check calling that player twice with naked top pair is just a huge, huge mistake. I have seen so much more, just winning more since I've started punishing that type of behavior, like just pouncing on it and betting the turn aggressively wide against players that really turn their hand face up as like naked one pair. You can, especially if you have like pair plus low, worst pair plus low uncounterfeitable, like suddenly, even not uncounterfeitable, suddenly my worst river card, which is me making bad two pair, lets me scoop pretty often. So against aggressive players, it's really important you don't even bother with these hands, because are just going to be ending up playing a guessing game out of position very often, unless you kind of hammer the flop, which is a lot harder to do with only a 3-card hand. Okay, so now we've kind of moved on to the widest of wide ranges that I'm willing to defend. And I want to talk a little bit about blind versus blind play here, and kind of how I'm planning on playing post flop in that situation. Because the games are always so limp, happy, and passive, it's pretty often where you'd find players uncomfortable in the situation. So it's important we have a pretty good feel for the type of stuff that I would expect a aggressive small blind to be opening, and then how we're going to be defending against it. So the first thing I want to just talk about is strategy-wise, blind versus blind. How are you playing? You want to, when I say keep your range in mind, it's important that you don't just 3-bet your very, very best hands here and let your opponent call and then check fold. And it's important that if the player is raising very, very wide and you want to be, and you're not wanting to 3-bet wide in response, that you want to be calling a ton of your strong hands. In other words, I have no problem with like a pretty aggressive 3-betting range here against aggressive players. And in the end, against the laggiest ones, I think it's the most profitable simply because we can build pots in position. But if you're new to the game or you're just adjusting to these shorthanded situations, I would just suggest calling a lot, and even calling some hands you plan on 3-betting. You want some protection in your range. You want some hands you can call 2 or 3 times with. And post flop, what we're going to end up doing is taking our good ace 2s there that we don't 3-bet and turning them into semi-bluff races on the turn. Or, basically free roll raise on the turn with our good ace 2, simply because combinatorically we should be way ahead. But we'll look more into that. But the important thing is you're always keeping your range in mind here. And this is one of those situations too where that whole idea of should I raise a hand pre-flop or not, should I not raise anything, really comes kind of into full circle very quickly. You get a feel for the way players think they're supposed to be playing. So in general, this is still a situation where wheel cards are going to be very, very good. Now, I'm much more willing to call wide, which would go into our wheel, worse than wheel for low needs help. I'm still avoiding naked 78 bad unpaired hands like the plague. Like there's just no need to even bother with hands like that. Now, being out of position as a preflop raiser from the small blind is a pretty big disadvantage post-flop. So we're pretty happy to call with almost all the wheel no help hands at all, because we can play our low draws aggressively post-flop, punish our opponent with their small weak pairs, and put them in a lot of tough spots. In terms of the amount of help I need now, because I'm going to be in position for my non-wheel lows, it is dramatically lower. But I really want to avoid that 86, 87 part of it as much as possible, unless the other 2 cards are really helping out. Even like a Jack 10, 7, 8. You're in position. It's going to be a lot easier for you to play that hand. You don't have to be worrying about check calling. And you're getting 3-1 with the button in that spot. So I'm calling almost all of my hands against an aggressive small blind. It's just such a more profitable situation. It is a 4-card game. And our opponent has to react to us post-flop. Now, a big reason why that's okay, and a big reason why I would just avoid most of those hands for right now, if you're not comfortable with post-flop play, is because we're going to play our whole range of hands pretty much closer to the same way. Like, we're either going to be very aggressive on the flop and things like that against certain opponent types, or we're going to be tightening up our pre-flop range and kind of waiting and raising more later streets and punishing our opponent for bluffing and barreling too much. But for now, I think still needing that help for your extra wheels, and just opening up a little bit to maybe those double suited hands only need a single suit, and spots where we needed a 5, we only need a 6. It's going to be enough for us to call in position. It's just going to be so much tougher for the villain out of position to be playing a guessing game. And on that note, danglers and those hands I talked about before are just not as bad. Like, I'm never folding those 3-card Broadways versus any open because we have the button now. So we can raise good turn cards against this villain, the villain would have to barrel us out of position with those weak 2 pairs, which is a must-worst spot. And what's nice too is the last word on the big street lets us decide whether or not we want to get that value bet in. So those weak 2 pairs that maybe we're calling sometimes and losing against, well, now they're going to check call for a bet on the river as a loss, as opposed to the villain just letting them, like the villain basically being able to play perfect poker in position against us, and we just really playing a guessing game because, again, this whole time we're trying to put together how these people think they're supposed to be playing Omaha 8 or better. So when we have position and the ability to value bet more, it's okay for us to be calling a little bit wider. So let's kind of wrap up the big blind here with just blind defense guidelines. How are we approaching this as a function of our other ranges and other seats? In general, we're just looking to avoid non-wheel lows out of position. There are a lot of reasons I've kind of beat that to death this episode, but it's really important. Those middling cards do you little to no good, and one of my happier moments is seeing a player defend, like I said, the 8-7-7-4, just the stone unplayable out of position. You can't look at 4 cards the same way in 08 as you do in Omaha High. That makes literal no sense. It's a completely different game. Half the money goes in a different direction. And that's not even that good of a PLO hand anyway. Now, another thing to keep in mind, I didn't really talk about 4-card high hands. I'm never really 3-betting those out of the blinds. I don't think it makes much sense, especially when we talk about post-flop. We expect those board textures to have good fold equity. We expect us to have good fold equity on those board textures. Now, when it comes to what is your high hand doing, what do I mean by that? It's important to have a post-flop game plan with your high hand before you even decide whether or not to take a flop with it. Is your high hand hoping to flop top pair and then maybe get checked down? Is your high hand going to be able to make some nut straights? Is your high hand going to make top set? What is the part of your high hand that this does here? How likely is it that if we do make top pair, we don't need to know the math behind this, but you do need to know if I do make, like, how likely is this hand to have top pair, and then what kind of lows can I have with it then? Like a hand like King, Queen, 2-3, yes, we can have top pair, but we can never have top pair plus the nut low. It's just not possible with that hand. And really, like, the question you need to be asking is, am I hoping to flop 2 pair or better here? And if that's what you need to do, you need to be getting a pretty good price before you want to be considering calling. So that's something to keep in mind. Now, a good way to kind of gauge yourself and see, kind of judge your own progress, because win rate is one thing, but I mean, I know it's a more loose and passive game, but it's very easy to run very bad for a long time at Omaha 8 or better. And when we're trying to play kind of to the pulse of the game here and kind of creating this dynamic game plan, it's important that we keep an eye on what we expect to be happening post-flop. What do we really think these other players are going to be doing? Am I defending my King, Queen, 10-6 with the Queen 6 of spades against a player that I think is going to check back the turn 80%? And the last 3 times they bet the turn. And the last 3 times that player's bet, the last 3 times or 4 other times they've been in a hand, they've bet the turn as well. Like, am I deluding myself here? Does it make no sense? And it's important to match up with that all and say, is that all happening? Is the way I am seeing these hands to play post-flop out actually happening? Now, we're going to talk, obviously, next week on flop play approach from in position and out of position. But in general, if you think about it from the perspective of the player in position, you're forced to react to my actions. Yes, players can donk bet, et cetera, but that's fine. You're still out of position. It's a pretty big disadvantage. And when we're out of position, we are the one reacting to that action. So we need to be keeping an eye on whether or not, A, what we think is happening is actually happening, and B, are our reactions to that, and is the way we're formulating this game plan out of position, is that the right approach? Do we think it's the right approach? Okay, so we've basically discussed what we're opening from all the seats. What are we defending from out of position here? What kind of stuff are we defending from the blinds versus tight opens, loose opens, and what does a blind battle kind of look like in an 08 game? Pre-flop 3-betting in 4-card games in general is very unique, and even more so when it comes to Omaha 8 or better. If you compare no limit hold'em to PLO, one thing that happens a lot more in PLO is there's a 3-bet and then a cold call. All right, there's no all-in necessary. You have 4 cards, so you can hit a lot more board textures. There's also just a lot more hands that are very good that kind of don't want to re-raise. That's something that can happen. In other words, you have ace king versus queens in a no limit hold'em game, but in a 4-card game, you can have aces versus queen jack 10-9 versus 5-6-7-8 versus queen queen 3-3 or something like that. There's a lot of hands that maybe want to hit a bunch of flops. So when we're 3-betting pre-flop in a 4-card game, we're kind of playing with a little bit more respect for the other players around the table. Now, you can also draw that same parallel there if we go now, by the way, from no limit hold'em and PLO to limit hold'em and Omaha 8 or better. It's kind of the same thing where in a limit hold'em game, we're not expecting anyone to fold to our 3-bets. And the same is true in a limit Omaha 8 or better game. And there's even more of the raising our 3-bets are now cold called. So as I was saying though, 3-betting pre-flop in Omaha 8 or better isn't just about our hands. It's about kind of the way we see our hand interacting with the other players at the table and setting ourselves up for good post-flop situations because we have no fold equity. I mean, the literal none. Maybe once or twice if someone has raised and folded to my 3-bet, but it's always online, so I just chalk it up to a misclick. And players, again, we talked about that Boolean approach to is a hand playable. Well, that's just really elasticity, right? Is there any elasticity for their calling range here pre-flop? In other words, are they sensitive at all to the price of the call? So if it's 4 bets cold to them and they have ace 2, are they still going to call? Well, it's a playable hand, so you better believe I'm going to call. Now, we've got up here 2 super premium hands on the board. I've got ace 2, 3, 4 double suited and ace king queen 2 double suited. I didn't want to just say like pre-flop 3-betting, your premiums are pretty good, because in general, when we're playing against super duper tight players, we're always not happy about 3-betting anyway. So we're probably going to be calling. And against the more loose aggressive players, it's not that big of a mistake to be 3-betting them pretty aggressively. But it's more about what the hands do when they 3-bet and why we might want to cold call versus 3-bet and how that's going to affect post-flop play. And, it's kind of a tell that I have it listed up here, ace 2, 3, 4 and ace king queen 2. Because you see that I want to focus on the difference between the high and the low aspect. In general, the high cards that go along with your low help play better heads up. The ace king queen 2 is so good, I'm going to probably be 3-betting it almost always anyway because it's just such a good hand. But in general, something like ace Broadway, Broadway wheel premium, those hands that we might be opening from under the gun that we discussed in the 6-max range, those hands play much better for a 3-bet to the point where you're better off trying to push out the action behind you to try to play a pot heads up. Now, what's nice about these hands is they're so good that if we do get called, they still play, and this is why they're double suited, right? Because, how often do we need a flush heads up? But the fact that these hands are double suited allow us to play well multi-way. Now, ace 2, 3, 4 double suited. If we 3-bet that, there's a lot of board textures that we continuation bet on that are just actually pure bluffs, right? On an ace 2, of course, we could flop, ace 2x, but that's something. We could flop 2, 7, 8, but again, that's the 2-pair draw. But ace 2, 3, 4 on king, queen, jack, all diamonds is just a stone cold bluff, and we really only can put 1 bet in. So there's a little bit of downside there playing against loose aggressive players. Also, it just plays so well multi-way, and we could jam it so often that it may be worth considering cold calling a hand like that versus a loose open to try to welcome more players into the hand. That being said, any situation with multiple players in the pot already, we really just want to make the pot as big as possible. So if it goes raise and cold call, I'm not hoping to invite more players because everyone's already been invited. They've already taken off their coats and had their first drink at that point when there's multiple players in the pot. More importantly, even so, in the small blind and in the big blind. When there's a raise and a bunch of calls and you have something as good as these hands, it's important to be jamming. We'll talk a little bit about those spots as we go forward through some more 3-betting topics. Now, I just talked a little bit about this all, so I won't reiterate everything, but 3-betting keys, again, number one, our 3-bets are for value. We don't have any fold equity here when we 3-bet. We have fold equity to our left, so there is value in isolation, but I would put that under the value umbrella. In other words, this hand is better to 3-bet because this player's range is wide and I can potentially get them heads up. The funny thing is, when their range is that wide, it's probably okay enough for us to call there. So we are now 3-betting for the extra value there. The question you want to be asking yourself at all points in times, though, is what does a 3-bet accomplish? I was hinting at it with the ace-2-3-4 hand there, but what are we trying to accomplish when we 3-bet a hand like ace-2-3-4 double suited out of the small blind? We're trying to get everyone to put some more money in because we think in general we're going to get about half those chips back at least, and sometimes just even more. And, one thing you can't really count on is people's post-flop play. It's sporadic, which is why we're formulating this game plan and which is why we're paying attention to frequencies and constantly keeping ourselves in check and all these things. But we can't really bank on a continuation bet and getting to check raise the field. And plus, what if it's a player in late position that raise? So it's just a good spot to be, that's a good spot to be building a pot. Are we 3-betting to isolate? The thing you want to avoid, the big mistake, is 3-betting because you think you have to, i.e. because you have pocket aces. So therefore you think you have to raise. I mean, there could be some very real situations where folding pocket aces is correct. If the hand doesn't play ball multi-play and you have to call a raise in a 3-bet or something like that, hey, 2 of the aces are dead, so that means there's no more to come on the flop, so the other 2 cards don't really matter much. And you're really going to just play a hand with a naked pair of aces, like, ace, 7, jack, rainbow or something, when you can never flop top set of aces. But it's important to know what your 3-bet is trying to accomplish. And the only way you can do that is with the awareness of the people to your left at all points in times, right? I'm trying to push those people out, or I'm trying to keep those people in. The person to your right that you're 3-betting, I'm trying to isolate that person. I am just raising for value because my hand is good, and I know the people to my left don't care. Yeah. And most importantly, and kind of the reason why I wanted to hammer this home the most, is 3-betting does not equal initiative. When we're isolating wide, you notice we have the 2 high card hands, the premium big cards to go with some low help. And again, like as I mentioned, those are hands we can continuation bet pretty much 100%. And that's a big reason why I like 3-betting those hands in that spot. Now, if I was to 3-bet ace-2-3-4 double suited out of the small blind and get called in 7 ways, and the flop was king, queen, jack, all diamonds, I would just check and fold. The reason why we can be 3-betting these hands out of position so, honestly, almost obnoxiously, just like turning our hand face up, is because people don't affect their post-flop play. If there's lack of elasticity pre-flop for calling, street-to-street logic isn't something you find in your average poker player, right? Someone paying attention to what happens from street A to street B, and sometimes people just ignore it. So we're raising in this spot. We're 3-betting in this spot. What are we trying to accomplish? We're trying to build a pot, and that is people we're assuming are just going to read us for always c-betting. And when we check, it's not like, oh, he checks and gives up a good amount and only bets with the goods, but that's the way we can play, and that's what you can get away with. But it's important to remember that 3-betting does not equal initiative. If I did 3-bet light and got cold call behind, I'm not going to light a bet on fire. If my fold equity is that low and my equity is that low, I have absolute nothing, then I have no incentive to bet. And it's something that can happen in Limit Omaha 8 or better. It really can't happen in many other games, right? In non-limit formats, you can give people worse prices. And, here people are getting the best price they can get because it's a limit game. And also equities run super close and players like to call down. So it's just something to keep in mind. Don't burn that extra bet, right? 3-bets have value because our hands have strength, but the only reason why that happens, like hands, you don't just get dealt a hand and then you magically get chips. You have to play it well post-flop. So something to keep in mind. So finally, just to kind of wrap up here, we're going to cover just 3-bet ranges in general. This has really been alluded to through most of this. I just wanted to cover kind of the logic behind 3-betting. But we're pretty much always 3-betting our ultra premium hands. What do I mean by ultra premiums? Your suited ace-twos that are very good with good help going for them. Your ace, Broadway, wheel, double suited type hands. The very, very best. I know I probably come up with a better phrase than ultra premium, but the cream of the crop, you cannot be making that big of a mistake 3-betting. And a big reason why I am a fan of that too is a lot of that people not respecting my small blind 3-bet, even though it's only the nuts, comes from having a good aggressive image in late position. And again, players playing out of position is not very good. Making big pots, very profitable. We talked about it before as well. High plus wheel for isolation is in terms of high only. I'm not high only. In terms of 3-betting hands for, this is the type of hand that I'm much more excited to be 3-betting a loose aggressive player with. I think, for example, Ace 3 7 9 rainbow versus Ace Jack 10 5 with a suit. Some players may say, well, the 3 is better than the 5. I'd rather have that. But if I'm 3-betting an aggressive player, I kind of want the suit. I want to have just a stronger high hand in general. Because the low is not nearly as important if this player is going to be bombing it away with, 5 6 queen 9 there or something like that from the cutoff. Like if they're that wide, I'd rather just have something that can make some top pairs, that can take some heat on a lot of board textures. Where in a hand like Ace 7 3 9 rainbow, I mean, you've got to flop a low draw because otherwise you really can't get, if you get check raised, you're kind of in trouble. So a big reason why we're picking our hands is the post-flop playability, which in essence is equity. So I think the logic is the same in Hold'em, but it doesn't translate as quickly. And we talked about it before, the lovely advantage of our multi-way pump hands that we want to pump the size of the pot multi-way. Just our super premium, low only. We're looking for suits, ace, and multiple wheel cards. These really just kind of overlap with the ultra premium, but it's just important that we are 3-betting those in multi-way pots to juice it. I think adding more players to the pot, a lot of people may take their foot off the gas and think like, well, maybe my hand's not nearly as good, but you should look at it more as getting players to put in extra bets, and then you get to dictate some post-flop action. And I talked about it before, the Jack 7-5 hand, just avoiding these bad pocket pairs. I know people feel gross like folding pocket queens when there's an under the gun open, but again, if as much as your queens maybe top pair at some point, you've now got to get 5 cards that are all below a queen on the board. Let's even put a queen in there. So there's no aces and kings. I mean, something's paired or there's a straight. We are going to be, even if we're in position, it's still kind of a guessing game. And what I love about players playing hands like this is they always have showdown value. So they automatically, they're going to pay you off once on the river. That about does it for this installment of Beginning Omaha 8. Blind play and 3-betting in general, I think, is pretty straightforward. We're just looking for good cards to pump the size of the pot and occasionally to isolate a player. I think blind defense is something you will certainly get better at with experience. Any questions or hands you've played out of position, please feel free to post them here in a thread or anywhere on the forums, and I'll keep my eyes peeled. Until next time, this is Chuck for DeucesCrack.com, and I'll see you on the forums.